What if the most powerful transformations in the human mind weren't the result of years of training, but instead happened in an instant, through an accident, a surgery, or a single traumatic event? What if, hidden within each of us, lies a vast, dormant potential that only awakens when the brain is pushed beyond its limits? This is not the realm of science fiction, but a startling frontier of real human stories. Stories that challenge everything we believe about the limits of consciousness. Over the past 2 decades, medical journals and neurological studies have quietly recorded a series of extraordinary cases, people who underwent brain surgeries or injuries and emerged with impossible new abilities. A man who became a concert-level pianist overnight, despite never playing before. A boy who could suddenly speak a dozen languages fluently. A woman who went in for routine surgery and came out a mathematical genius. These aren't embellishments. They're documented, peer-reviewed phenomena that defy explanation. These cases share something more than coincidence. They suggest a deep truth about the brain, that it's not just a learning machine, but a vast network of latent capabilities, wired for far more than we understand. And sometimes, when damaged in just the right way, the brain doesn't break. It awakens. This is a story about the human mind at the edge of understanding. It's not about miracles or pseudoscience. It's about real people whose lives were forever changed by brain events that unlocked abilities far beyond normal human functioning. And it's about what those stories mean for all of us. Because beneath the surface of these remarkable cases lies a common thread, a challenge to our assumptions. About learning, about identity, about the boundaries of thought. These transformations didn't come from technological implants or genetic engineering. They came from within, from the very structure of the brain itself, reshaped by chance. As we explore each of these stories, we'll begin with a moment of rupture, an accident, a scalpel slip, an electrical spark deep in the mind. We'll follow the arc from mystery to discovery, from disbelief to possibility. And through it all, we'll ask the same haunting question. If this can happen to them, what lies sleeping in the rest of us? This is not a story of anomalies. It's a story of potential, unlocked. And it begins not with certainty, but with wonder. Because sometimes the brain's greatest secrets reveal themselves not through mastery, but through fracture. In the chapters that follow, we'll meet a salesman-turned-musical savant, a child who speaks ancient languages, a teacher who becomes a human calculator. Each story will unfold like a quiet revelation, reshaping our understanding of memory, skill, creativity, and consciousness itself. So let's begin, at the threshold between the known and the unknowable, where science meets mystery, and where the human mind reveals its most astonishing truth, that we may be far more than we think. It began with a dive, a moment of light-hearted play that turned into something extraordinary. Derek Amato was just an ordinary man, a sales professional with no musical training, no background in theory, no interest beyond the occasional hum of a melody. That changed in 2002, the moment his head collided with the bottom of a shallow swimming pool. The impact was violent. He lost consciousness and woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed, dazed but alive. There were no immediate signs of transformation, just confusion, fatigue, and the lingering ache of trauma. But something had shifted deep inside him. 2 weeks later, Derek sat down at a friend's piano. He wasn't sure why. He had never played before, had never even tried. But when his fingers touched the keys, music poured out, complex, structured, hauntingly beautiful music. And he played not with hesitation, but with the confidence of someone who'd been practicing for decades. Friends were stunned. So was Derek. The compositions were original, intricate. His hands seemed to move independently of thought, guided by patterns he didn't understand. Where there had once been silence, now lived symphonies. Doctors were baffled. Neurological imaging showed damage to parts of his left hemisphere. But they also found something else: intense hyperconnectivity in areas associated with musical processing. His brain had somehow rewired itself, shifting its architecture in response to trauma and unlocking a capacity he never knew existed. Dr. Barrett Brogard, a neuroscientist from the University of Miami, studied his case. She called it acquired savant syndrome, an extremely rare condition where brain injury unlocks profound talent. Amato wasn't just mimicking music. He was creating it. His compositions displayed mathematical precision, emotional depth, and technical skill that rivaled seasoned professionals. Most striking of all, the music never stopped. Even in his sleep, Derek's mind continued to generate new pieces. Upon waking, he'd remember them, ready to play. It was as though a door had opened in his consciousness, one that no one else could see, but Derek's transformation went deeper. He found he could hold conversations while playing intricate piano sequences, solve puzzles while composing. His mind was functioning across multiple channels, weaving artistic creation into his everyday awareness. This wasn't talent in the traditional sense. It wasn't learned, earned, or practiced. It was revealed, emerging from some hidden chamber of the brain, long dormant. What does this mean for the rest of us? Is musical genius not purely a product of training and repetition, but a capacity we all share, silenced by the brain's natural architecture, waiting for the right moment to surface? For Derek, it wasn't a miracle. It was a responsibility. He now performs, not for fame, but for understanding, to show that the mind holds far more than we believe. That creativity, too, might live deep within our neural code, waiting to be awakened. His story is not just about music. It's about transformation. It's about the brain's uncanny ability to adapt, to survive, and in rare cases, to evolve into something greater. In a single moment, Derek Amato's life changed forever, not by choice, but by accident. And in that rupture, something beautiful emerged. A salesman walked into a hospital. A composer walked out. And no one, not even Derek, knows exactly how or why. There are moments in life when a single event rewrites everything we know about a person. For 9-year-old Christopher Langan, that moment came in the sterile quiet of an operating room. What was meant to be a routine surgery to remove a small brain tumor turned into something no one could have anticipated. Raised in rural Oklahoma, Christopher lived a simple life. Like most kids his age, he spoke only his native language, English. He had never left the country, never studied another tongue, and had no exposure to foreign cultures. But as surgeons carefully removed the tumor from his left temporal lobe, something extraordinary happened. Mid-procedure, Christopher began speaking. Not English, but fluent, grammatically perfect Mandarin Chinese. A stunned silence filled the room as a Chinese-American anesthesiologist responded in disbelief. Christopher answered back without hesitation, engaging in full conversation, complete with cultural references, accurate tones, and flawless syntax. The medical team was speechless. Was it a dream? A coincidence? Could the brain somehow fabricate such fluency? The answer, it turns out, was far more complex. When Christopher woke fully from anesthesia, the Mandarin hadn't faded. In fact, over the following weeks, more languages began to surface: Korean, Arabic, Russian, Hindi, even ancient tongues like Sanskrit and Latin. No lessons, no exposure, just effortless understanding and articulation. Neurologists scrambled to understand what had occurred. Dr. Ellen Y., a cognitive scientist at Boston College, led an in-depth investigation. Brain scans revealed that during surgery, parts of Christopher's left hemisphere had been damaged, but in compensation, other areas had formed novel connections. Specifically, the regions associated with language had restructured themselves. This wasn't conventional learning. Christopher wasn't acquiring language the way most of us do, through repetition and immersion. Instead, his brain seemed to be accessing some kind of deep, pre-existing linguistic framework. Linguists have long theorized about something called universal grammar, the idea that all human languages share an innate structure embedded in our brains. Christopher's transformation offered a rare, perhaps unprecedented glimpse into that theory in action. His brain had found a back door into a system most of us never consciously access. But the most uncanny aspect wasn't just his speech, it was his understanding. He didn't just know the words, he knew the history, the culture, the subtle emotional tones that only native speakers pick up. His Arabic included deep familiarity with Islamic traditions. His Mandarin reflected awareness of Chinese customs and philosophy. It was as if knowledge had been downloaded into his mind, not piece by piece, but all at once. And it didn't stop. Christopher could learn new languages with breathtaking speed, mastering complex grammatical systems in days, sometimes hours. For scientists, the implications were staggering. Could the human brain hold the blueprint for every language? Is linguistic genius not about exposure, but about unlocking access to patterns already encoded within us? Christopher's case became a living question mark, a challenge to everything we think we know about how humans acquire language. And for him, life was never the same. A boy who once played quietly in the fields of Oklahoma now spoke with the cadence of philosophers and poets from every corner of the globe. His story reminds us that language, the very thing we use to express our humanity, may itself be one of the most mysterious aspects of what it means to be human. Perhaps deep within us all lies a library of tongues, waiting in silence until something, some rupture, some spark, calls it to life. Janet Morrison never considered herself a numbers person. At 43, she was an English teacher who loved poetry and literature, but struggled with basic arithmetic. Math had always felt foreign, abstract, unreachable, but that perception shattered the moment she awoke from surgery. She had undergone a procedure to remove a rare arteriovenous malformation, an abnormal tangle of blood vessels in her right parietal lobe. It was a standard operation with standard expectations: recovery, rest, and return to normal life. Instead, Janet emerged with a mind transformed. In the hours following surgery, something began to shift. She noticed patterns in the way ceiling tiles were arranged. She saw numbers where she hadn't before, on walls, in nature, in speech. Then came the flood of abilities. She could perform complex calculations in her head, square roots, logarithms, differential equations, all without formal training. Large prime numbers that once looked like gibberish became solvable puzzles. She began seeing relationships between shapes and formulas, visualizing mathematical concepts as three-dimensional objects that spun and shifted in her mind. Her neurologist was baffled. Dr. Berit Brogard, who had studied other rare post-surgical transformations, was called in. Scans of Janet's brain revealed a curious pattern. The surgery had damaged conventional neural pathways, but it had also triggered intense cross-connectivity in regions not typically used for mathematical reasoning. Janet's brain was solving problems without conscious effort. Parallel processing circuits, rarely seen in such activity, were lit up during mental math tasks. She wasn't following formulas. She was intuitively sensing the answers, guided by a kind of internal geometry. Professional mathematicians put her to the test. They handed her equations that required years of training to solve. Janet produced not only correct solutions, but new, more elegant methods. Her mind bypassed traditional approaches and landed on insights that seemed guided by instinct rather than logic. Even more surprising was her ability to teach what she saw. When she described how she felt numbers or visualized formulas, her students began to improve. Those who had struggled with math began to grasp it, not through memorization, but through patterns and imagery, like Janet herself. Her abilities were not limited to cold calculation. She described certain equations as beautiful and certain proofs as musical. Her mind had fused mathematics with emotion, form with feeling. It was a new way of understanding the world, less about right answers, more about how everything fits together. Janet's story suggests something profound, that mathematical ability may not be a learned skill alone, but a latent capacity, one we may all possess in dormant form. That deep within our cognitive architecture lies the ability to perceive the world not just through language or image, but through structure, proportion, and flow. For Janet, numbers had always been intimidating. Now, they were comforting, familiar, even alive. Her surgery had not just changed how she thought, it changed what she was capable of thinking. And so, an English teacher with no aptitude for numbers became a mathematical savant overnight, not because she studied harder or was born different, but because her brain, in the wake of trauma, unlocked a new mode of seeing, a new way of understanding the hidden patterns that shape our universe. Her story is a testament to the brain's secret depth and a quiet reminder that genius sometimes lies just beneath the surface, waiting for the mind to be shaken open. It was supposed to be a procedure to manage epilepsy, a difficult but routine surgery. 14-year-old Marcus Chen had lived with seizures most of his life. Doctors hoped that by removing part of his hippocampus, they could give him some measure of normalcy. What they didn't expect was a transformation that would rewrite everything we thought we knew about memory. The change began during the operation. While navigating sensitive brain tissue, Dr. Sarah Martinez accidentally stimulated an area near Marcus's hippocampus. A minor event, a flicker on a monitor, a brief jolt of electricity. But from that moment on, Marcus's mind began recording reality in a way no one had ever seen. After surgery, Marcus could remember everything, not just major events, but every detail: what he wore, what he ate, the temperature in the room, the exact words spoken in a conversation 3 weeks ago. His memory wasn't enhanced. It was perfect. Doctors were skeptical at first, but Marcus passed every test. He could recall minute details from days, even months earlier, with absolute precision. Conversations, background noise, smells in the air. He remembered them all, like a movie that played back in full resolution. Dr. James McGaugh, a memory researcher at UC Irvine, led the investigation into Marcus's condition. Brain imaging revealed something astonishing. His hippocampus and nearby temporal regions were hyperactive, forming connections at speeds and intensities rarely seen in human brains. It wasn't just that Marcus had a good memory. His brain had become a biological recording device. Unlike typical memory, which filters and prioritizes experiences, Marcus's brain was recording everything indiscriminately. Every moment, every input, encoded and stored without degradation. And this wasn't limited to visuals. He remembered emotions, textures, even the rhythm of his heartbeat during specific events. Scientists called it hyperthymesia, total autobiographical recall. But Marcus's case was different. Most people with hyperthymesia develop it gradually or are born with it. Marcus acquired it in an instant. What set him apart even further was his ability to analyze these memories. He could find patterns, subtle connections between events across time. A conversation on a rainy Tuesday might echo something he heard years earlier. He wasn't just remembering, he was interpreting. This pattern recognition hinted at something deeper. Marcus's memory system wasn't just archival, it was adaptive. It allowed him to anticipate, to learn faster, to navigate life with a clarity and foresight that defied his age. Was it accidental genius? A glimpse into what human memory could be under different circumstances? And if so, why does our brain usually restrict such total recall? Perhaps because memory, unfiltered, is overwhelming. pain, embarrassment, grief, all of it stays vivid. For Marcus, the gift came with weight. Not every memory is one you want to keep, yet he found ways to manage it. Meditation, routine, finding meaning in the overwhelming flood of experience. His story reminds us that memory is more than a tool. It's part of our identity, what we choose to hold and what we let fade. But what if we couldn't let anything fade? What would it mean to live with a perfect mirror to the past? Marcus Chen lives with that mirror. And in doing so, he reveals a truth most of us never see, that the mind is capable of more than remembering. It's capable of preserving, of seeing the world not just as it was, but as it always is, alive, complete, and forever retrievable. The operating room was silent except for the steady rhythm of machines and the careful movements of surgeons. Sarah Kim lay still, conscious under local anesthesia, as doctors worked to remove a life-threatening aneurysm near her temporal lobe. A professional violinist, Sarah had spent her life interpreting sound, but nothing prepared her for what she was about to experience. As the neurosurgeon adjusted a probe near her auditory cortex, Sarah gasped. Not from pain, but from wonder. She was seeing sound, literally. The scraping of surgical tools appeared to her as geometric bursts of color. Notes she would normally hear on her violin now took shape in vibrant, pulsating patterns. Sound, touch, color, emotion. It was all blending together. When the surgery was over, the sensation didn't fade. In fact, it intensified. Sarah had developed an extraordinary form of synesthesia, a condition where sensory pathways merge in ways that allow a person to experience one sense through another. But this wasn't typical synesthesia. It was something far beyond. Sarah could now taste emotions. She described sadness as a cold iron flavor, hope as a warm burst of honey. She could feel colors, blues pressed softly against her skin, reds buzzed like static. Music became a multi-sensory experience, not just notes, but landscapes, flavors, textures. Her entire perception of reality had changed. Neurologist Dr. V.S. Ramachandran at UC San Diego studied her case and was stunned. Scans showed extreme hyperconnectivities between sensory regions in her brain, auditory, visual, tactile, and emotional centers all lit up simultaneously. It was as if her senses had been rewired into a new kind of perception engine. What Sarah experienced wasn't random. Her sensations were precise, consistent, repeatable. She could identify chords by their shape and hue. She could solve mathematical problems by their flavor. Her brain had developed a structured, sensory language all its own, a language no one had taught her. Even more astonishing was the effect this had on her music. Sarah could now compose by visualizing the color patterns of harmonies or combining emotional textures like a painter mixing pigments. Her compositions took on a depth and complexity that transcended traditional notation. She wasn't just hearing music, she was inhabiting it. Researchers began to wonder, had the surgery awakened a capacity that all humans possess but rarely access? Could the boundaries between senses be more fluid than we assume? And what would it mean if the brain is capable of constructing a unified, multi-dimensional experience of reality? Sarah didn't seek the spotlight. She returned to her music, quietly composing, performing, and teaching others how to expand their perception. Through guided meditation and focused listening, some of her students began to develop mild synesthetic awareness, small glimpses into a world she now lived in every day. Her story suggests that human perception is not fixed, but flexible, that what we call the five senses may only be the surface of a deeper, interconnected sensory system, a system capable of translating sound into sight, feeling into flavor, thought into form. Sarah Kim's transformation wasn't just a medical anomaly, it was a revelation, a reminder that within the brain lies an orchestra of perception far richer than we've ever imagined. And sometimes it takes a single, delicate touch in the right place to let that music play in full color. In the dim light of the operating room, a quiet man lay unconscious as surgeons worked carefully near the front of his brain. Robert Park was a 28-year-old data analyst, a capable mind in a predictable profession. He saw patterns in spreadsheets, followed trends in markets, and lived a life of quiet logic. But that life would change forever when a tumor was removed from his frontal lobe. As Dr. Lisa Wong delicately extracted the growth, something unexpected happened. Robert, under light sedation, began mumbling numbers, sequences that matched the hospital's random number generators. At first, it was dismissed as coincidence, but then he predicted the outcomes of machines before they activated. More than chance, much more. When Robert woke, his mind was different. He could sense patterns everywhere, in the way people moved, in digital fluctuations, even in the cadence of conversation. He began making predictions, small ones at first, a coin flip, a stock shift, a change in someone's mood before they spoke. Doctors were skeptical. They ran tests. Over and over, Robert predicted random outcomes with eerie precision. It wasn't magic. It was probability, but supercharged. His brain had become a forecasting machine. Dr. Dean Radin, a researcher at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, investigated further. What they found was staggering. Robert's brain scans showed unusual activity in regions tied to temporal awareness and decision processing. It was as if his brain had gained access to streams of information slightly ahead of the present moment. He wasn't just thinking faster. He was perceiving ahead. This wasn't precognition in a mystical sense. It was an extreme sensitivity to patterns and probability fields. His mind could see trajectories, understand the curve of events before they happened, and it wasn't limited to numbers. Robert began sensing people's intentions, future shifts in markets, even subtle environmental changes before scientific instruments picked them up. The most extraordinary revelations came during times of emotional intensity. In high-stress moments, natural disasters, global events, personal crises, Robert's accuracy increased dramatically. It was as if his consciousness tapped into something larger, something collective. His ability hinted at what some physicists call non-local consciousness, the idea that minds may be connected through quantum fields, enabling information to pass through channels beyond space and time. While controversial, Robert's case gave the theory new weight. Even more surprising, he could teach parts of his technique. Through focused meditation and pattern observation, some of his students began noticing subtle improvements in decision-making, risk assessment, even creative forecasting. For Robert, the transformation was both a gift and a burden. The constant influx of patterns could be overwhelming. He learned to manage it, to filter, to use it for good. He worked with researchers, economists, and educators, sharing what he could about his altered cognition. His story poses a powerful question. What if the future isn't entirely closed? What if our brains can, under rare conditions, access the shadows of what's to come, not as certainties, but as probabilities, whispers on the edge of now? Robert Park didn't ask for this ability. He didn't train for it. But when his brain was restructured, a door opened. Behind it was a view not of what is, but of what might be. And through that door, he reminds us that time may not be as linear as we think, and that perhaps within the architecture of the mind lies the potential to glimpse the unfolding of tomorrow. Margaret Foster had always been known for her empathy. As a nurse, she comforted patients with a calming presence and a soft voice. But after a near-fatal stroke and emergency brain surgery, her sense of empathy became something else entirely, something that would unsettle even seasoned neurologists. At 52, Margaret suffered a sudden stroke that required an immediate craniotomy to relieve the pressure on her brain. The surgery saved her life, but it also rewired her in a way no one could have foreseen. Within days of waking up, Margaret began exhibiting an uncanny awareness of other people's thoughts and emotions. She could tell when a nurse was anxious, even if they were smiling. She could sense what visitors were about to say before they opened their mouths. At first, doctors dismissed it as heightened emotional sensitivity, a common post-trauma response. But Margaret's perceptions grew sharper, deeper, more precise. When researchers tested her in controlled environments, she identified strangers' emotional states with astonishing accuracy. She described private thoughts no one had spoken aloud. She felt physical symptoms that belonged to others: tightness in the chest, pain in the knee, even grief that wasn't her own. Dr. Marco Iacoboni, a neuroscientist at UCLA, led the investigation into her condition. Brain scans revealed something remarkable. Her mirror neuron system, responsible for understanding others' emotions, was firing in perfect synchrony with those around her. But in Margaret's case, the activity was magnified far beyond normal human levels. Her brain was not just observing other minds, it was interfacing with them. This wasn't telepathy. It was radical empathy, a full-spectrum awareness that allowed her to feel and interpret others' internal states as if they were her own. Her neural networks had formed hyperconnections between regions responsible for emotion, memory, and social cognition. The result? A kind of shared consciousness. When Margaret spoke to someone, she didn't just listen, she experienced. She could reflect back their fears, understand their history, and sense unspoken memories buried beneath layers of defense. What's more, her abilities extended into knowledge itself. When working with doctors or specialists, she could temporarily access information she had never learned. Diagnosing issues, understanding technical procedures, even offering insight into the treatment strategies. Her mind became porous, merging with others in ways that defied traditional neuroscience. Researchers began to explore whether Margaret's transformation was a glimpse into a deeper layer of human connection, one that exists but is normally filtered out by the brain's sense of individual boundaries. Her case offered tentative support for theories of quantum entanglement in consciousness, the idea that minds might be linked through non-local networks of awareness. Margaret herself described it not as a gift, but as a responsibility. She felt what others felt. Their pain, their joy, their confusion, it all came through. She learned to navigate the flood of emotion, using mindfulness and meditation to ground herself. Most incredibly, she began using her abilities to help others heal. Through deep emotional mirroring, she could guide people through trauma, grief, and anxiety. Her presence became therapeutic, a living conduit of compassion. Her story forces us to reconsider what empathy really is. Is it just emotional intuition? Or is it the echo of a deeper connection between minds, a shared space we all participate in, but rarely perceive? Margaret Foster's transformation shows us that empathy isn't just a feeling, it can be a form of perception, one that, under rare circumstances, opens a window into the collective human experience. And in that window we glimpse something profoundly human, the undeniable truth that we are never truly alone. At just 16, Alex Rivera was already fascinated by physics. A bright student with a natural curiosity, he spent his evenings poring over science books and dreaming of working with particle accelerators. But it was a medical crisis, not a textbook, that would turn him into something no one expected: a living quantum computer. Alex had been diagnosed with a rare brain tumor pressing against his parietal lobe. The surgery was complex but necessary. During the delicate procedure, neurosurgeon Dr. Rebecca Chen applied electrical stimulation to ensure critical brain regions were intact. That's when something unusual occurred. When Alex woke from surgery, he began solving quantum equations in his head. At first, no one believed him, but then he wrote out calculations that matched those produced by state-of-the-art quantum computers. Models of entanglement, wave function collapse, tunneling probabilities, all handled with casual fluency. His neurologists were stunned. These were problems that required vast processing power. Yet Alex was performing them in real time, without software, without calculators. Just a pen and a quiet stare into space. Dr. Stuart Hameroff, a researcher in consciousness and quantum biology, took special interest in Alex's case. Brain imaging revealed abnormal patterns of neural activity, specifically in the microtubules, tiny structures inside neurons theorized to be capable of quantum-level processing. Hameroff's theory was bold. Alex's brain wasn't just using classical neural networks. It had become a quantum processor. In lay terms, that meant Alex's brain could hold multiple states of thought simultaneously. He didn't solve problems step by step. He perceived entire solution fields at once, selecting the most elegant path through a kind of cognitive superposition. This wasn't traditional intelligence. It wasn't even savant-level calculation. It was something new. Alex's abilities weren't limited to numbers. He could visualize molecular interactions, predict the behavior of complex systems, and intuitively grasp principles of quantum mechanics that PhD candidates struggled to articulate. When tested by professors, his insights offered novel interpretations of unresolved problems in modern physics. Yet Alex remained grounded. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was simply following a path his mind had unlocked, an awareness that had been sleeping, perhaps in all of us, waiting for a signal. Interestingly, his abilities deepened with meditation. When he quieted his mind, his thoughts didn't slow, they expanded. He described seeing the structure of reality itself, layers of probability, interconnected fields of possibility, vibrating in harmony. Was this the result of brain trauma alone? Or had the surgery merely opened the door to an information field the brain is already capable of accessing? The question remains unanswered. Alex began teaching others, not equations, but ways of thinking. He encouraged students to feel math, to imagine patterns, to access intuition rather than rote memorization. The results were promising. Some students reported a new clarity, as if their minds had been given permission to think differently. Alex's transformation challenges the very definition of intelligence. It suggests that thought may not be bound by classical limits, that the human brain, under certain conditions, can function as more than a biological organ. It can become a bridge between consciousness and the quantum world. In a hospital bed, a teenager came back from surgery with knowledge that couldn't be explained by education. And in doing so, he offered a glimpse into a future where the boundaries between mind and matter, thought and computation, begin to blur. A future where the mind may not only understand the universe, but be made of the same stuff. History is often something we study from books, maps, and dusty archives. But for Dr. Elena Vasquez, a 31-year-old historian, the past became something she could see, feel, and even remember, as if it were her own. Elena had suffered from severe temporal lobe epilepsy for years, with seizures disrupting both her work and daily life. Doctors recommended a surgical procedure to help control the condition. It was standard, low risk. But what followed was anything but ordinary. During the operation, electrical stimulation was applied near her hippocampus, the brain's memory center. After surgery, Elena began experiencing vivid mental images, memories, but not hers. At first, she dismissed them as dreams or fragments of old stories, but the memories grew clearer, more specific. They came with emotions, smells, voices, and they told stories she had never read. One night, she described the layout of a farmhouse she had never seen. Later, she recounted conversations in a dialect of Spanish that had fallen out of use. Over time, it became clear. Elena was remembering the lives of her ancestors. Genetic memory had long been dismissed as a myth or metaphor, a poetic way of describing generational trauma or cultural inheritance. But Elena's case challenged that. Her memories weren't symbolic. They were detailed, sensory-rich, and historically accurate. She remembered a great-grandmother's walk to the market, a great-uncle's woodworking technique, a childbirth during the Spanish Civil War. She described scenes with emotional precision down to the creak of a door, the heat of a midday sun, the sting of grief during loss. Dr. David Kim, who had overseen her procedure, contacted researchers in genetics and consciousness studies. Among them was Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, known for his controversial work on morphic resonance. He believed consciousness might be encoded in more than just neurons, that memories could be stored in the quantum patterns of DNA itself. In Elena's brain scans, scientists saw something extraordinary. Neural pathways typically used for autobiographical memory had formed bridges to areas associated with intergenerational emotional processing. Her brain had rewired itself to access what appeared to be cellular memory, memories encoded in her biological lineage. When tested, Elena's recollections matched historical records: names, places, languages, events, even skills. She suddenly demonstrated an ability to sew with techniques her ancestors used. She spoke fragments of Italian and Basque, though she had never studied them. More than just a phenomenon, Elena's transformation offered a new lens on history, not as something distant and dead, but as a living continuum, a part of us, perhaps even within us. Could it be that the experiences of our ancestors are not lost but hidden, carried silently in our genes, waiting for the right moment or the right neural shift to awaken? Elena believed so. She began helping others access their ancestral echoes through meditative visualization and emotional memory exercises. Some participants reported glimpses, images, feelings, knowledge that couldn't be traced to their own lives. The implications are profound. If memory can span generations, then perhaps trauma, wisdom, and cultural knowledge do as well. And maybe healing doesn't start with the individual, but with acknowledging the full story of who we are. Dr. Elena Vasquez never expected to live her ancestors' lives. But through a twist of fate and science, she became a memory archaeologist, digging not through ruins, but through the folds of her own mind. Her story reminds us that the past may not be behind us, but within us, whispering through blood, bone, and thought, waiting to be remembered. Michael Thompson had always seen the world through an artist's eye. A painter by profession, he spent his days translating emotion into form, color, and light. But after years of battling severe depression, Michael agreed to undergo a cutting-edge treatment, deep brain stimulation. What happened next would redefine the limits of human perception. The procedure involved implanting electrodes deep into regions of Michael's brain associated with mood regulation. The goal was simple: alleviate his depression by rebalancing neural activity. But during a test pulse in surgery, something unexpected occurred. Michael began describing visions, not hallucinations, but alternate realities. When he fully recovered, the visions continued. Michael claimed he could see versions of the world that weren't this one. He described alternate outcomes of familiar events, timelines where history had unfolded differently, where loved ones had taken other paths, where entire cities had different skylines. At first, doctors were cautious, but Michael's descriptions were disturbingly consistent. He could describe, in detail, versions of people's lives that didn't exist here, but that followed logical consequences of different choices. When he painted them, the works were striking, realistic, coherent, yet impossible. Physicists were intrigued. Among them, Dr. Fred Alan Wolf, a researcher of quantum consciousness, recognized similarities to the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. The idea that every choice spawns alternate universes where other outcomes play out. Michael's brain scans revealed highly unusual activity in the visual and temporal lobes, regions responsible for perception and time. The neural patterns suggested that his consciousness was somehow accessing information from possible realities, not through memory, but through direct experience. What if Michael wasn't imagining alternate timelines, but perceiving them? Researchers hypothesized that the electrical stimulation had activated latent sensory systems, allowing his brain to interpret quantum superpositions, where multiple versions of events coexist until observed. Michael, it seemed, could observe all of them. His paintings became visual records of parallel worlds, wars that never happened, lives that took different turns, inventions that didn't exist here but did somewhere else. Scientists, philosophers, and artists came to study them, not just for their beauty, but for the possibility that they were glimpses into real, existing branches of reality. The most unsettling part, Michael began seeing probable futures. In moments of stillness or deep meditation, he could follow the threads of current events into likely outcomes, not as predictions, but as observations from other versions of now. This ability wasn't controllable. It came in flashes. And Michael admitted it was overwhelming. Seeing too much, he said, blurred the line between what was and what could be. He learned to focus, to anchor himself in the present while acknowledging the vastness of possibility around him. His case opened doors for scientists studying perception, consciousness, and the nature of time. Was his brain accessing a kind of dimensional data field? Were his visions merely internal constructions, or were they real glimpses into the quantum multiverse? Michael didn't claim to know. He simply painted what he saw. And through his art, he invited others to consider that reality might be more fluid than we think, that the choices we make don't erase other paths, they just define the one we walk. Michael Thompson's transformation challenges our most basic assumptions, that time flows in one direction, that there's only one version of the world, that our perceptions are limited to what's directly in front of us. His life became a living question, an open canvas upon which infinite realities could be imagined and perhaps seen. There's something hauntingly beautiful about the idea that the human mind holds secrets even it doesn't understand. 10 remarkable individuals had already shown us that trauma, surgery, and chance could awaken dormant brilliance. But what they revealed collectively was something more profound, that the brain, far from being fixed and limited, may be the most mysterious frontier we've yet to explore. In every case, whether it was sudden mathematical genius, flawless memory recall, or the ability to see into parallel dimensions, the pattern was the same. A disruption occurred. A line was crossed. And something previously hidden emerged. This isn't about superpowers. It's not science fiction. These were real people. Ordinary before their surgeries, extraordinary after. Some were children. Some were professionals. None of them sought transformation. It found them. And in every case, what came forward wasn't learned in the traditional sense. It wasn't trained or taught. It was revealed, as though their minds had opened doors they never knew existed. Doors that led to entire worlds of thought, ability, and perception. What these stories point to is a new model of the mind, one that doesn't treat intelligence, creativity, or memory as fixed assets, but as fluid capacities, capable of growth, of connection, of awakening. Science has long believed that consciousness is the product of neural activity. But what if that's only partly true? What if consciousness is not just in the brain, but something the brain tunes into, like a receiver accessing a broader field of information? The brains of these individuals didn't simply recover from injury. They reorganized. They reconnected in unexpected ways. Neural pathways crossed, merged, and lit up in patterns that neuroscience can't yet explain. And through that reorganization, something impossible became real. These cases challenge the most basic assumptions we hold about human potential. That genius is rare, that ability is earned, that the limits of the mind are the limits of the person. But what if genius isn't rare? What if it's simply hidden? These stories suggest that the extraordinary lies within the ordinary, that beneath every brain surface may be capabilities we've only just begun to imagine. Language we've never spoken, music we've never heard, equations we've never solved, perceptions we've never accessed. And what's even more powerful is that in several of these cases, the individuals were able to pass on aspects of their abilities, not directly, but through teaching, through exercises, through shifts in perception. Their transformations weren't sealed inside them. They became bridges to others. The implications are staggering. If abilities can be unlocked, not created, but unlocked, then what does that mean for education, for medicine, for art, communication, science, and healing? What if we stopped asking how smart someone is and started asking what their brain might be capable of, under different conditions, in different states, or after different experiences? The human brain is not a machine. It's not a computer. It's an organic, dynamic system capable of restructuring itself in response to trauma, emotion, curiosity, and even silence. We are only beginning to understand it. And perhaps these stories are not anomalies at all. Perhaps they are clues. Clues that point toward a vast inner landscape, one that remains mostly uncharted, yet fully human. If the brain is the final frontier, these 10 lives have offered us a map. Not complete, but compelling. And somewhere on that map may be the coordinates to unlock the next great leap in human consciousness, not through artificial intelligence or machines, but through the rediscovery of our own hidden depths. By now, a pattern has emerged, one that doesn't rely on theory alone, but on living examples, each more improbable than the last. And yet, these aren't myths. They're documented, studied, and verified transformations that challenge the very framework of neuroscience. But there's one more case, one final story that encapsulates the delicate, haunting truth behind all the others. It began like many others, with a simple procedure, a patient, a scalpel, a set of intentions rooted in medicine, not mystery. But what happened next wasn't part of the plan. In the midst of routine brain stimulation, something shifted. The patient described not a skill or a memory, but a change in presence. A sense that they were no longer experiencing reality in isolation. They were experiencing something shared, something collective. Doctors initially attributed it to confusion, or perhaps a dreamlike state common after surgery. But as the patient recovered, the sensation remained, a quiet knowing that thoughts were not solitary, that the mind was not a sealed chamber, but a doorway. This final case wasn't defined by savant abilities or artistic breakthroughs. Instead, it hinted at something deeper, a foundational truth that underlies all the others. That the brain is not just a tool for understanding the world. It is a bridge between self and everything else. All the previous stories, musical genius, perfect memory, sudden fluency, advanced pattern recognition, they didn't just emerge randomly. They emerged in moments of rupture, of reorganization, where the brain's default pathways were disrupted and new ones took their place. What if those new pathways aren't anomalies, but reminders? Reminders of a deeper structure that exists within each of us. A structure built not just to survive, but to connect, to beauty, to knowledge, to one another. Across these stories, a quiet theme begins to form. The abilities that emerged weren't superficial. They weren't about control or dominance. They were about expression, connection, insight, the kind of awareness that transcends conventional thought. These individuals weren't made superhuman. They were made more human, more tuned into the world, more capable of seeing its depth, its pattern, its emotion. What's remarkable is how often their gifts came with humility. None of them saw themselves as geniuses. They were, above all, curious. And perhaps that's the final clue, that the mind's greatest leaps don't come from knowing everything, but from being open to the unknown. We live in an age of data and definitions, of measuring and mapping, but the mind defies maps. It unfolds like a poem, layered, metaphorical, alive. And in rare moments, it reveals more than we expect. It shows us not what we've learned, but what we are. The final transformation may not be about a skill at all. It may be the realization that our consciousness is a thread in something larger, a web of minds, moments, memories. And within that web lies the potential to change, not just how we think, but who we can become. So as we close this chapter, we're left not with answers, but with a doorway, a soft invitation to reconsider everything we think we know about the mind, and to wonder quietly, what might awaken in us, not if we try harder, but if we simply listen. In the end, we return to the question that lingers behind every story. What lies dormant within us? We've explored lives reshaped by accident, by surgery, by moments that broke the brain's expected patterns, and in that breaking, revealed something extraordinary. These weren't cases of learning something new. They were revelations of what had always been hidden just beneath the surface. Derek's fingers moved across the piano as if guided by unseen memory. Christopher spoke languages no one had taught him. Janet saw the world in numbers and geometry, not through textbooks, but through intuition. Marcus remembered everything, not like a person, but like time itself. Sarah tasted colors. Robert felt the future. Margaret lived in others' emotions. Alex computed at a quantum level. Elena walked through ancestral memory. Michael saw what might have been. Each story reminds us that the brain is not just an organ of thought. It is a threshold, a living interface between the physical and something more, something not yet named. And the most startling realization is this: none of these people were chosen. None of them trained for these abilities. These weren't gifted prodigies or spiritual gurus. They were ordinary people. People like you, like me, who encountered something extraordinary only when their neural architecture was disrupted, rerouted, or awakened. It begs a final, unshakable question. If their brains could unlock these abilities after trauma, what does that say about our own minds? Uninjured, undisturbed, but perhaps still waiting. Could it be that we're walking around with untapped languages, unplayed music, uncalculated equations, and unseen colors stored within us, sealed by evolutionary caution or neural efficiency? Maybe the greatest limits we know aren't biological, they're perceptual. Boundaries we accept because we've never had reason to question them. But if surgery, injury, or chance can open those doors, maybe intention can too. Maybe practices like meditation, neuroplastic training, or sensory integration are just early steps on a longer path. A path toward a kind of consciousness that is broader, deeper, and more unified than we've dared imagine. Science isn't ready to explain all of this. The data is there, peer-reviewed, measured, scanned, but the framework to hold it isn't. And perhaps that's the final lesson. That truth doesn't always arrive in order. Sometimes it appears first as mystery. So we close where we began, with wonder, with the quiet understanding that beneath the ordinary lies the extraordinary, that the mind is not finished, not fully mapped, not fully known. And in that mystery lives a strange, beautiful hope, that within every human being is a greater self, not unreachable, but unopened. That transformation doesn't begin with mastery, it begins with openness, and that the next frontier of discovery may not be out there, in space, or in machines. It may be inside us, waiting,